August 6, 1943. The sky above the fields of France is a bruised purple, thick with heat and the acrid smoke of burning fuel. A single American P-47 Thunderbolt, call sign Razorback, its nose painted with teeth, limps through the clouds trailing glycol coolant like blood from an open wound. Its canopy is shattered. One wing droops at an angle that should be impossible. The engine sputters, coughs, almost dies, then catches again. Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert S. Johnson grips the stick with hands that have begun to shake, not from fear, from the realization that he should be dead. Behind him, in tighter formation than conscience should allow, three of the Luftwaffe's finest close in: Oberfeldwebel Walter Wolfram, Feldwebel Heinz Baer, Oberleutnant Kurt Bühligen. Between them, they have claimed over 200 Allied aircraft. They have seen every trick, every desperate maneuver, every prayer whispered into an oxygen mask. They have watched rivals fall from the sky like wounded birds, trailing smoke and silence. They know the mathematics of air combat the way a butcher knows meat. And now, in their gun sights, is something that refuses to die. This is the story of a moment that would ripple through the entire German fighter force, a moment when three of Europe's deadliest pilots discovered that the greatest power in the world had given its sons something more than capability. It had given them redundancy. It had given them abundance. It had given them the material expression of a philosophy so foreign to their experience that no doctrine manual could have prepared them for it. The moment when German aces learned, with a clarity that would haunt some of them for the rest of their lives, that they were not fighting an enemy. They were fighting a system. The Thunderbolt had been born from American soil with American assumptions baked into its DNA. While German engineers had spent years perfecting the Bf-109, a machine so finely tuned that a single poorly welded seam could bring it down, so dependent on precision that combat damage often meant death, American designers had gone in the opposite direction. Make it heavy, make it redundant, make it so the young men who flew it might survive their own mistakes and the mathematics of chance. The result was a fighter that weighed nearly 9,000 pounds empty, carried enough ammunition to sustain a minute-long burst, and featured self-sealing fuel tanks that the Germans had only recently adopted as an emergency measure. The P-47 Thunderbolt was, in essence, a flying application of American industrial philosophy: overkill as doctrine, overbuilt, oversized, overarmed. It was designed by a nation that had never known resource scarcity, that could afford to waste steel and aluminum on redundancy, that could equip its fighters with hydraulic systems so robust they had manual backups, and manual backups to the backups. Where German fighters achieved performance through elegance, American fighters achieved it through sheer, grinding, immovable force. But this particular P-47, in the hands of Captain Robert S. Johnson, represented something even more: a living demonstration of what happened when such a machine was flown by a pilot who understood that his job was not to engage superior pilots in a contest of skill. His job was to survive, to function, to keep flying until the odds broke in his favor or until he crossed back over friendly territory. Johnson had already claimed 13 confirmed kills by this August morning. He was no rookie, but neither was he among the most celebrated of American aces. What he was, instead, was persistent, methodical. He flew not to prove his courage, but to accomplish his mission. And his mission, on this particular day, was to escort bombers to their target and bring them home. When the fighters came, he had done his job. He had engaged them. And when the engagement had gone poorly, when cannon shells from multiple directions had begun punching through his aircraft with a sound like hammers on a tin roof, he had done the only thing available to him. He had kept flying. The first burst from Wolfram's cannon had come from above and behind. 19-millimeter rounds, traveling at speeds that melted air itself. 3 of them had torn through the canopy, and one had creased Johnson's skull, close enough that he felt the heat, close enough that any film of oil or coolant would have set his head ablaze. But his skull remained intact, his brain remained functional, and his aircraft remained capable of flight, though only barely. The second pass came from Heinz Bear, approaching from the starboard side. This was supposed to be the kill run, the moment when the German pilot finished what his comrades had started. Bear was a perfectionist. He had already lived longer than most fighter pilots because he did not believe in quick kills. He believed in deliberation, in placing his rounds where they would cause maximum structural damage. 8 rounds hit the fuselage, 2 hit the wing. 1 passed through the cockpit just behind Johnson's seat and embedded itself in the armor plating that the manufacturers had welded there. Not out of mercy, but out of the same industrial faith. Give your young men as many chances to survive as your factories can produce. But Johnson's aircraft was still flying, the instrument panel still glowed, the stick still responded to his touch. The engine, though running hot and burning oil at a rate that meant minutes of flight remaining rather than hours, continued to turn the propeller. It was in this moment that something shifted in the minds of the German pilots. It was not a dramatic realization. It was more like the slow dawning that accompanies the recognition of an impossible truth. These 3 men had each spent years in combat. They had learned to read aircraft the way musicians read scores, to understand from the patterns of damage what remained functional and what had died. They had seen the Spitfire, that elegant English machine that depended so heavily on precise engineering that a single catastrophic hit often meant the end. They had seen the Soviet fighters, tough but simple, enduring but not complex enough to survive the kind of sustained punishment that modern warfare delivered. But this American machine was different. It was not elegant. It was not simple. It was a battering ram. It was the mechanical equivalent of an American serviceman's ration, over-calculated, over-provisioned, somehow inedible, and yet somehow sustaining. It kept going because it had been built to keep going. It had backup systems behind its primary systems. It had armor behind its fuel cells. It had redundancy built into its very structure the way bone has redundancy, the way a human body carries 2 lungs and 2 kidneys, not because one of each is insufficient, but because the designers knew that wastage could mean survival. Boulegen made the 3rd pass, and in his combat report, written later with the precision of German military documentation, he would note something that marked him as a sensitive observer among killers. He wrote that the American had extraordinary defensive capability, not extraordinary piloting skill, not extraordinary luck. Extraordinary capability built into the airframe itself. The rounds from his cannon found their marks. More damage, more smoke, more systems failing. But when the pass ended, the P-47 was still flying, still climbing, though barely, still maneuverable enough that the next pass would be harder than the last. What occurred next was not a dramatic reversal of fortune. It was something subtler. It was the moment when the mathematics of air combat shifted. The German pilots, flying machines that were more efficient, more elegant, more precise, suddenly understood that efficiency was not enough. Their Bf-109s carried cannon that fired rounds more powerful than the 50 caliber machine guns in the Thunderbolt. But they carried fewer of them for shorter periods, with less redundancy in their ammunition feed systems. The math said that the German pilots should have overwhelming advantage, but the P-47 refused the logic. Each hit that should have been fatal somehow was not. Each system that failed had backup. Each structural damage that would have doomed a 109 was merely absorbed. The machine was not fighting back through maneuverability. It was not fighting back through superior weapons. It was fighting back through the simple, grinding, infuriating fact that it had been built to absorb punishment. It was a machine that rejected the entire German philosophy of aerial combat, the idea that victory went to the pilot with the keenest eyes, the steadiest nerves, the highest skill. This machine suggested something else, that victory sometimes went to the pilot with the thickest armor and the longest fuel range. The three German aces broke off their attack. There would be other opportunities, other American fighters other days. But something had changed in their understanding. The enemy was not the American pilot, though Robert Johnson was a skilled and determined flyer. The enemy was American industry itself. It was a system that could manufacture fighters like it produced automobiles, that could replace losses faster than they could accumulate them, that could equip each machine with the margin for error that reflected the material assumptions of a continent-spanning economy. This realization, slow-burning and never quite articulated in official terms, would come to define the German Pilot Corps' understanding of the war in its final years. They were not losing to superior pilots. They were losing to superior systems. They were losing to a nation that had decided that every young man in a cockpit deserved a machine built not for perfection, but for survival. Captain Johnson's P-47 made it back to its airfield in southern England. The damage assessment, completed by maintenance crews working into the evening, revealed the depth of what the machine had endured. 31 bullet and cannon shell holes, some of them large enough to pass a man's fist through. The left wing damaged to the point that the crew chief recommended major structural repair, the engine running so hot and burning oil so rapidly that a normal landing would likely have ended in fire. The hydraulic lines compromised in 3 separate locations. The ammunition feed system for the machine guns disrupted. The oxygen system partially destroyed. Any one of these conditions in a German fighter would likely have been fatal. Combined in the airframe of almost any other Allied fighter, they would certainly have been fatal. But the P-47 was designed by a nation that could afford to be pessimistic about the future of its young pilots. It was designed by engineers who believed that complexity and redundancy could purchase time, and that time could purchase survival. Johnson himself walked away from his aircraft without injury. His hands would stop shaking within an hour. He would file his combat report with the precision of a professional soldier, and within a week he would be back in the air, flying another P-47, pursuing another bomber escort mission, fighting the same war against the same enemies, in the same machine that had already proven it could absorb a killing blow. In the weeks that followed, as intelligence reports filtered through the Luftwaffe command structure, there was a subtle shift in doctrine, not an official rewriting of procedures, not an acknowledgement of defeat or inadequacy, but a recognition among pilots who had staked their lives on the precision of German engineering that something in the calculus had changed. The American fighters were not becoming more nimble. They were not becoming faster. They were becoming more able to absorb damage, to operate with systems partially destroyed, to continue functioning when German machines would have fallen from the sky. Some of the German aces would adapt to this new reality. They would learn to avoid engagement with the Thunderbolt when possible, to seek other targets, to fight in ways that did not require sustained dogfights with American machines that seemed to violate the laws of physics by continuing to fly. Others would become increasingly bitter about the inequality of the contest, not because they lacked skill, but because their skill had become almost irrelevant in the face of machines built to ignore skill and reward only the crude mathematics of survival. Heinz Baer, who would survive the war and live to old age, would occasionally speak in his later years about this aspect of the air war. He would say that the greatest advantage the Americans possessed was not pilot training, not tactical innovation, but simply the capacity to build aircraft that absorbed punishment. His voice in these recollections carried a note of something between respect and frustration. It was the tone of a master musician forced to compete in an arena where the rules of music did not apply, where volume mattered more than precision, where redundancy defeated elegance. The P-47 Thunderbolt became, in the minds of German pilots, something almost symbolic, not symbolic of American skill or bravery or innovation in the traditional sense, symbolic instead of American abundance, symbolic of a nation that could build fighters and replace them, arm them and replace the weapons, equip them with pilots and replace the pilots, all at a rate and scale that made German calculations of attrition obsolete. Where German pilots had learned to see the sky as a territory to be mastered through superiority, American pilots were learning to see it as a resource to be conquered through application of mass. The specific encounter on August 6, 1943, became something of a legend within certain circles. Pilots would speak of it in the ready rooms. The story would shift and change, as legends do. The damage became more severe. The number of German fighters increased. The escape became more dramatic. But at its core remained this essential truth, that an American fighter had absorbed enough fire to kill any machine more perfect than itself, and had lived to fly again. This represented something that German doctrine had never quite accommodated, the possibility that the war would not be decided by the best pilot, in the best machine, making the best decision in the critical moment. It might be decided instead by the nation that could afford to make the most mistakes, that could build machines able to survive those mistakes, that could accept the inefficiency of redundancy, because the inefficiency could be absorbed by an economy operating at a scale that had no German equivalent. For Robert Johnson, the encounter would become one of many. He would eventually claim 28 confirmed aerial victories, tying him with several other American aces for the highest score among European theater. Pilots. He would survive the war, but more importantly, he would survive this moment, and many like it, not because he was the better pilot, but because the machine beneath him had been built to absorb his vulnerability and the vulnerability of every American pilot who flew it. The P-47 was a machine without poetry. It was a machine without elegance. It was a machine that embodied the material philosophy of a nation that believed in second chances, in redundancy, in the axiom that a wasteful abundance was preferable to a perfect economy if that perfection required precision too fine for young men in combat to maintain. It was a machine that said, without words, that American democracy did not fight its wars through the superior capabilities of its elite, but through the aggregate power of its material foundations. The three German aces who had poured cannon fire into Johnson's Thunderbolt on that August morning would each survive the war in different ways. Some would be shot down, some would survive to old age, but all of them would carry, for the rest of their lives, the memory of a machine that should have died, but didn't. A machine that absorbed punishment that should have been fatal. A machine that represented not the peak of engineering excellence, but the power of a system too large and too abundant to be defeated through individual skill or individual sacrifice. This is the deeper truth that emerged from such encounters. The air war over Europe was not, in its final analysis, a contest between pilots. It was a contest between systems. Between the German system of concentrated excellence, the best pilots, the finest machines, but finite in number and vulnerable to attrition, and the American system of distributed abundance, adequate pilots, adequate machines, but in such quantity and with such redundancy built into each unit that no level of German excellence could overcome the simple mathematics of American production. The Thunderbolt embodies this truth in its very structure, heavy where the German fighters were light, redundant where they were efficient, multiple where they were singular. It was not the most beautiful machine in the sky. It was not the most elegant. It was not the fastest or most maneuverable. But it was perhaps the most honest representation of how the Second World War would ultimately be won. Not through the superiority of individual warriors, but through the superior capacity to sustain warriors in the face of enormous loss. Not through perfect machines, but through machines built to absorb imperfection. Not through scarcity carefully managed, but through abundance thoughtlessly applied. In the final analysis, the story of the P-47 and the German aces who could not quite bring it down is the story of two philosophies colliding in the sky. One philosophy believed that war was decided by the finest specimens of human and mechanical capability. The other believed that war was decided by the capacity to overwhelm through sheer material provision. The war itself would decide which philosophy was correct. But on August 6, 1943, above the fields of France, the answer was already becoming apparent. It was embedded in the structure of a single aircraft that had been hit and hit again and still refused to fall from the sky. A machine that embodied not the peak of human ambition, but the power of a system too large and too abundant to be denied. As the sun set on European skies in those final years of war, German pilots looked up at formations of P-47s and understood, with a clarity that no briefing could have imparted, that they were fighting against something more powerful than courage, more dangerous than skill, more inevitable than the mathematics of individual combat. They were fighting against the material expression of a distant nation's abundance. And against that, no amount of German excellence could finally prevail.